Hello everyone, welcome back to another day in this The Clown Decade. Today we are carrying on with Grace Blakeley talking Marxist nonsense. All the introductions to this are in part 1, so if you've not seen it, please go back and watch it. Otherwise I won't waste any more of your time because I only managed to get through 10 minutes of the talk last time. Hopefully this time we can get through quite a bit more. Please take it away.
Okay, I was going to ask you about planned economies, which are typically associated with communism, but seeing as you mentioned feudalism, we had Yanis Varoufakis in here a couple of months ago talking about techno-feudalism, right?
Well, that sounds like a great genre of music. Do you have any examples of it?
And this idea that actually we're past capitalism now, and what our modern economic model, it actually far more closely resembles feudalism than a lot of people would like to believe.
Oh, right. No, he's just an idiot. Well, no, as I mentioned last time, what was it, 94% of our modern rich people, billionaires and millionaires, are self-made? You don't get self-made rich people in feudalism. It's just a ridiculous thing to say.
That these sort of cloud capital, these huge companies, these huge corporations are actually, in a way, modern feudal lords.
Well, in the way that they are a collective of people underneath a boss, I suppose if you want to reduce feudalism to that, then yeah, sure, but as I say, that's very reductive. And if you're describing that phenomenon as feudalism, then absolutely every social organisation is feudal. Yes, even communist ones, because you will still have leaders within these organisations.
I agree with a lot of his analysis.
Well, of course you do, but the only reason you agree with it is because it's a good rhetorical tool. If you say we're in feudalism now, people will think, oh, that's very medieval, isn't it? And it will naturally get people that you've successfully gaslit onto your side.
But I think we come at it from different perspectives, because whilst, a lot of the stuff that he writes about in terms of like the detail and the analysis as to what's happening with the economy, I totally agree with.
There's a lot of assumed knowledge here. I have no idea what he writes about when it comes to the economy, but as I said before, if he is trying to say that we're effectively under feudal lords, then he's just simply wrong. I have a Samsung phone. I don't give a tithe to Samsung. I give a standing order to Vodafone, who I bought it off, because the full price of it was, like £300-400 or something like that, and so I owe them 20 quid a month for 2 years. If you think that's in any way like feudalism, where it was multi-generational families all under one lord, who had to give 10% of their crop yield to the lord every month, then again, that's a completely different thing. Being in debt doesn't mean you're under feudalism.
I just think that that is part of capitalism.
So it's an argument about semantics. So there we go. Grace Blakeley, yes, is indeed an economic idiot. Look at that Oxford education go wild.
And you see a lot of this stuff in kind of progressive economics, where you get critiques of the way that the economy works from people who say, well, this isn't real capitalism.
Well, I wouldn't call myself in the school of progressive economics. I didn't realise they were the type to say this isn't real capitalism. In fact, just having a quick look on Wikipedia, progressive economists think that leaving capitalist markets to operate with limited government regulation actually lead to inherently unfair outcomes that favour big businesses and big corporations, and this actually all needs to change with wealth redistribution. So I don't know what the hell she's talking about.
They say, like, for example, the dominance of finance means actually that you've got these, monopolistic banks kind of sucking rents out of the economy, as though they are kind of the modern examples of like feudal lords.
Yes, and as you mentioned in part 1, the government is facilitating that sort of thing. I don't agree it's feudalism, because there's no king who has the divine right of kings, with power over barons who have power over lords who obviously have power over knights and the peasants. I do agree, however, that companies like BlackRock are quite a bit of a problem, because they do manage to buy up an awful lot of the housing stock over in America and can effectively monopolise entire housing sectors in certain areas of the country. That's obviously an issue, but the whole reason they have the power to do that isn't because of a lack of government regulation, it's because there is too much of it. Because other companies are finding it difficult to actually compete with BlackRock. And actually also, economists that I follow, they weren't particularly happy in 2008 when all the banks got bailed out for free. That's another reason all these banks still exist. It's because they weren't allowed to fail. So yeah, we don't live in real capitalism because there are an awful lot of corporations that aren't allowed to fail by the government's divine wisdom.
Or, you've got too much concentrated corporate power. That means we don't have free markets, so it's not capitalism.
I mean, that's such a reductive statement to the argument I just made, because she completely misses out the point that she's already made, in which these corporations do exist as large as they do and for as long as they do because they keep lobbying the government to put through antitrust laws and ridiculous regulations so that other smaller companies can't compete because they just get priced out via taxation or the amount of money they need to spend on regulation. It's a perfectly reasonable argument, hence I subscribe to it, but to reduce it just to corporations exist, therefore you don't have capitalism, like, yeah, you can meme it that way, but you're missing out an awful lot of the argument there.
And again, I come back to this point that capitalism does not mean free markets.
But nothing you've said's been related to that at all. It's quite clear you don't understand the other side of the argument here, so it's quite stupid that there is absolutely no challenge to your position here, but Politics Joe is full of progressive economists, so what would I expect from them? Nothing but an echo chamber.
Those two things are not the same. Markets are an important part of the way that capitalism functions. They're a very important ideological part.
I really hate this whole markets are an ideology thing. I really hate it when people say capitalists are ideological. Some capitalists can be ideological. There's obviously no doubt about that. ANCAPs, for example, they're pure ideology. However, to say markets are an ideological concept, it's quite ridiculous. I mean, the whole thing can be laid out by Adam Smith in Wealth of Nations. My God, don't read that full book. It's ridiculous. Get the summarised version. But he wasn't ideologically attached to capitalism. He was just describing what was going on and describing the phenomenon that happens when you allow markets to do what they do. One of his great examples was a small child whose whole job it was to open and shut a little shutter on some sort of textile machine. And actually, the child worked out that all he had to do was attach a string to another part of the machine to the shutter, and the tempo was actually the same, so, you know, he effectively automated his own job so that he could go out and play cricket with his friends. And his point was, well, this is capitalism working. People will find more efficient ways to almost avoid doing work, or at the very least make their work much easier. And then in the end, this is going to save lots and lots of money. And, you know, you look at what things cost these days compared to the 1700s when Adam Smith wrote Wealth of Nations. You know, food's a lot cheaper, housing's a lot cheaper, technology has vastly improved, there's no doubt about that, and, you know, we've got to a point now where the poor aren't now malnourished, no, the poor are actually eating too much and getting fat and obese. Like, that's a great problem to have. You have absolutely destroyed the concept of poverty at that point. Probably why people like Tony Blair had to redefine poverty to then have a metric to say the Tories are doing badly, despite the fact that barely anyone's dying of malnutrition in the UK at the moment.
You have to believe that you're competing against other people in this market for your labour. Otherwise, the system loses legitimacy.
One of the largest worries in Britain at the moment is immigration. It's consistently in the top three. One of the main reasons for that is that people think that the job market has just been open to this massive, massive, massive amount of workers who are obviously going to massively raise the supply side of, you know, workers for jobs, which is going to massively, massively, massively as well lower the wages of jobs. This isn't about belief. People are seeing the consequences of economic reality there. You don't have to believe you're competing with anyone else. You just are. Doesn't matter what you believe, the reality is you are. To get on, say, panel shows or to become Vice's economics correspondent for 5 articles, you will be competing with other people. And as I say, Grace, you lost that job at Vice because you were garbage with your economics correspondence. So you were replaced. There was a competitive market there and you lost. Hence you now have to write books that are, quite frankly, 20 years out of date.
But the actual functioning of production in a capitalist system centres far more on stuff that happens within massive monopolistic corporations than it does on the interactions that take place in the market.
Does she know that that's still the market? You know, you can have companies competing with themselves. I mean, I know she's going to go on to explain that actually massive corporations own multiple other corporations. You know, pretty much every chocolate bar company is owned by the same mega corporation or something like that. They're still at competition with each other, and they are still seeing market forces inform their decisions. I mean, you know, Bud Light's a good example. They decided to make that questionable trans person their spokesman for a couple of months, and now nobody seems to want Bud Light. It doesn't matter that they also make 1,000 other types of beer. Bud Light started selling less, and so they had to react, and they tried to react by getting rid of Dylan, whatever he's called, and trying to actually appeal to the market that was buying Bud Light again. I mean, I don't think it worked. I'm not entirely sure. It happened over in America, but the point is that market forces still affect how these corporations act and where they put their resources. It's not particularly efficient because big corporations tend to react slower than smaller businesses, but again, the market conditions have been completely constrained by the fact that we have all these laws and regulations in place that effectively make it almost impossible for a small business to grow. And if they do grow, they get bought out anyway. Why? Because the big corporations can afford it, because they lobbied for that regulations to keep them big.
And this isn't a new thing. You know, in the book, I go back to just like the example of the East India Company, right?
Oh, good Lord, the history of the British Empire. I'd love to see what our takes on this are.
Where this was like this massive joint venture between some, you know, wealthy and powerful people who gained the right to create this big corporate entity, and the British state in pursuit of imperial power.
Yep, that's correct so far. They wanted to expand into the New World, see what there was over in India, and other corporations wanted to see what was over in America. I'd love to see where you're going with this and how you're going to try and relate it back to, you know, the modern day.
And that's another part of the book, which is that, you know, this nexus of power that we see at the level of the domestic economy, the kind of fusion of state and corporate power, is often projected over the whole world economy in the form of imperial power.
Yep, that's definitely happening in Africa, with pretty much every country subsidising different parts of the African economy. You know, China has a big hand in South Africa. America, well, did have its hand in Afghanistan, and that's not happening anymore. Though they're certainly cats pouring it more now than they were in the good old days of the British Empire, who frankly did it better, where they'd be pretty open and say, right, we're coming in here and we're ruling it because we have the means to, and because we're going to make your lives a hell of a lot better anyway. And as a general rule, that was probably true.
And yeah, this was a big part of the development of British capitalism, the East India Company. Adam Smith called it a strange absurdity. He said it was a state in the disguise of a merchant. And all the kind of original theorists of capitalism were like, this doesn't really make sense. This doesn't fit within the way that we think about capitalism.
Well, that's because it doesn't. I mean, it's true. It was a arm of the state, but it worked in such a way that, I mean, Adam Smith, I don't think she'll mention it, but Adam Smith at the end of Wealth of Nations also mentions that the empire is actually a net drain on the British economy. And she doesn't mention that despite the fact that that was their contention with it. They probably wouldn't care if it was actually making a profit, and they'd probably say, oh, this is capitalism. But it's because, and Marxists are always wrong about this as well, not everything is about economics. An awful lot of the time, this East India Company, they were simply going out there to explore. They were taking a risk, saying, let's go out here, see what's out here. Oh, look, we found tea in India. And that's where tea started to become a big staple of Britain. And obviously they had poppies for opium as well, which they started forcing the Chinese to buy. But as I said, it was actually a net drain. And when it came to, you know, extracting resources, quote unquote, well, they could do that because the Indians, the Chinese, the Africans, whatever, they weren't extracting it themselves to the extent that the British were, because, well, they didn't really know what to do with it, unlike what the British knew what to do with it, which was make a hell of a lot of steel factories, to make even more factories, to make textiles, to, you know, make sugar over in the Caribbean. You know, they had supply chains that they needed to prop up, and it probably wasn't actually the best way to do it, but projecting world power, and eventually after 1815 becoming the world hegemon and having complete control of the seas, it was worth the empire losing money over that, because frankly it made for one of the most peaceful times in history.
But it was, you know, companies like the East India Company and the AIC itself were central to the development of this, of the capitalist system across the world.
There was always going to be an inevitability that there would be a, you know, system of world trade. I mean, technically there always was a system of world trade, even if you go as far back as the Roman times. It's what the Silk Road was. People always want to trade with each other because capitalism, by definition, leads to people making purchases that are always in their benefit. It is, if someone buys something off someone else, it is always because that commodity or service or whatever is worth more than the money you're paying for it. That's the ultimate reason capitalism has led to world growth. And obviously that's not true in every case, in, say, case of fraud or something like that. But this is why minimal regulation is accepted by pretty much every capitalist in the world. Obviously, ANCAPs would say, well, they'd quickly go out of business because no one will trust them, and that's probably true too, but I'm on the side that a few rules here and there are okay. So to say that the East India Company made this ideological system and spread it out and we've not been able to get away from it, well, actually, that was under mercantilism, which was anything but laissez-faire and was actually, I'd say, quite similar to modern corporations where, yes, they were the only ones that were really allowed to exist, and they were the only ones who were allowed to expand the British Empire at the time. They went a bit more laissez-faire with it in the 1800s, and oh, wouldn't you know, we ended up with Australia, Canada, and a third of the planet.
So there isn't this clean distinction between, corporate power and kind of free market capitalism. Those two things go hand in hand.
It's amazing how she can explain how there are actually differences between capitalism and corporatism, and then end it all off by concluding actually there isn't a difference. She just refuses to listen to the other side of the debate here. That's all that's going on. I mean, the East India Company, it dissolved in 1874. I just want to point out that in 1874 till the First World War, that was when Britain was at its peak of economic growth, when it had the most capitalist system we have ever seen on the planet. A huge corporation that was the start of taking over India dissolved. I don't think Grace Blakeley could name a single monopoly from the 1800s. I mean, I literally just Googled that, by the way. I bet that the East India Company didn't even last to the 20th century. And I was correct. In fact, it was the British states that decided we can't have this corporation anymore due to its failures in India. In the aftermath of the Indian Rebellion of 1857, and under the provision of the Government of India Act 1858, the British government nationalised the company. The British government took over its Indian possessions, its administrative powers and machinery, and its armed forces. The company had already divested itself of its commercial trading assets in India in favour of the UK government from 1833, with the latter assuming the debts and obligations of the company, which are to be serviced and paid from tax revenue raised in India. In return, the shareholders voted to accept an annual dividend of 10.5%, guaranteed for 40 years, likewise to be funded from India, with the final payoff to redeem outstanding shares. The debt obligations continued beyond dissolution and were only extinguished by the UK government during the Second World War. The company remained in existence in vestigial form, continuing to manage the tea trade on behalf of the British government and the supply of St Helena, until East India Stock Dividend Redemption Act 1873 came into effect on January 1st, 1874. The Act provided for the formal dissolution of the company on 1 January 1874, after the final dividend payment and communication or redemption of its stock, and the Times commented, "It accomplished a work such as the whole history of the human race no other trading company ever attempted, and such as none surely is likely to attempt in the years to come." In short, the British government realised that the East India Company was failing due to the Indian Rebellion, decided we need to take over and make sure the Indians don't rebel again, and the best way to do that is just take over ourselves and dissolve the East India Company that was failing. See, that's what you would not see today. You would instead see constant government bailouts, as we have been continually seeing for years at this point. So I actually prefer it this way. The only time I'm in favour of nationalising an industry is for the government to dissolve it. And believe it or not, Grace Blakeley, that is actually capitalism working. A company that is failing is actually almost forced to fail.
I've forgotten the name of it now, but there's a method of system analysis which basically says if you want to understand the intention of a system, you don't look at how it was designed, you just look at the outcomes,
exactly,
right?
Yeah.
Oh, well, if we're using that system analysis, communism is intended for mass murder. Rent controls are simply there to make more homeless people.
And so if you look at capitalism and you say, well, modern capitalism is defined by financialisation, by the extraction of economic rent, then actually it doesn't particularly matter if that was never the intention. If that's what it is now, then actually that's one of the defining characteristics.
Exactly.
My God, I love how this type of analysis is only applied to corporatism, and then it's only used to then say that corporatism is capitalism. Honestly, this is such an unbelievably surface level take. I'm not surprised that people at Politics Joe think Grace Blakeley is this soothsayer of economics. This type of analysis is never used for anything else, by the way. Never anything done by left-wingers. Never applied to Venezuela. No, this is simply say for, the world economy we have today that they keep calling capitalism.
And I think there is, you can start by looking at the outcomes, of course, and that is important, and saying that capitalism kind of isn't working in the way it's supposed to. It kind of harkens back to people who are like, oh, well, the state socialism practiced in the USSR isn't real state socialism.
No, notice how she doesn't say Marxist socialism there, by the way. She says state socialism. I'd just like to point that out again. I mean, she's using what's called the Gary Lineker analysis there, where one time Gary Lineker said it's not a real England versus Germany game unless the result is 4-2 to England. Anything else where England and Germany play and it's any other result, it's not a real England-Germany game because England beat Germany for the World Cup with a 4-2 result. And the difference here is that, yes, a lot of Marxists keep disowning Marxist projects because you don't get the outcomes you like. However, when you look at the way it was all implemented, they were all for it at the time. They said there's nothing wrong with any of this. The difference here is that capitalists have been saying for decades, and I do mean decades, because I have read articles that they have been making for the past few decades about how it's not capitalism. They were against an awful lot of these policies in the first place. They were happiest under Margaret Thatcher, but still had criticisms of it, and then started making criticisms when, yes, Tony Blair came in and started nationalising the railways and things like that. An awful lot of them don't think we've been under any sort of, well, true neoliberalism, i.e. free market capitalism, specifically that part, since at least the late 90s when Tony Blair got in. They realised what Tony Blair's policies were, and they thought, oh, no, this isn't going to be good. But that's all ignored, because it doesn't help with saying they wanted all this to happen, because they didn't.
I think that was state socialism, and it's different to democratic socialism, which is what I'm arguing for.
It's so funny when Marxists say this, because it actually was the original idea for the USSR to be democratically socialist, and pretty quickly it was abolished. In post-revolutionary Russia, local workers' Soviets would elect representatives that go on to form regional Soviets, which go up and up and up. Later, the Supreme Soviet of the Soviet Union would become the highest legislative body of the entire country. After Lenin's party, the Bolsheviks, only got a minority of the vote in the elections to the Russian Constituent Assembly, he disbanded it by force after its first meeting, citing the refusal of the right socialist revolutionaries and Mensheviks to honour the sovereignty of Soviet democracy, arguing that the system in which parliamentary democracy was sovereign could not fairly represent the workers since it was in practice dominated by the bourgeoisie, that the proportional representation did not take into account the socialist revolutionary split, and that the Soviets more accurately represented the opinion of the people, which had changed as shown in the elections to the Soviets between the time of elections to the Assembly and the first meeting of the Assembly. He also explicitly stated that democracy did not include those considered bourgeoisie. In other words, democratic socialists are liars. They do not want democratic socialism, because if they did want democratic socialism, they would do as Lenin did and get rid of all the people that don't vote the right way. Absolutely hilarious. Democratic socialism will inevitably lead to state socialism anyway, because the only way you can get socialism to work is by ignoring the will of your average person.
But it's kind of a bit of a... It's kind of a non-argument, isn't it, really? It's like capitalism could be this nice, lovely, fluffy, wonderful thing, but it's just not working because it's being kind of corrupted by people at the top.
This is just such pure projection. That is what every Marxist has said. Everyone should read Socialism, the Failed Idea That Never Dies. That is exactly the argument that people like Owen Jones make about Venezuela. Oh, it was going really well and then it quickly didn't because the people at the top. When people like Thomas Sowell or people like Christian Niemietz, they can actually point to people and policy, in fact, and say, look, these are the reasons that we don't really live under a proper capitalist free market system. We are living in a pseudo-socialist state. We have things like the NHS. Corporations are always lobbying for, the modern thing is tech companies lobbying for AI regulations. There's actually groups and people who are physically there that we can point to and say, yeah, that's your problem. What Marxists tend to do is say, oh, it's the bourgeoisie, it's this magical, mythical class of people that we can't quite point to that is ruining it. When in reality, it's just your god-awful leaders and your god-awful ideology.
And often this actually veers into like anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, right? Because people say, oh, capitalism is this lovely system, but it's being corrupted by kind of evil financiers or, weird kind of lizard people or whatever. I'm not up to date with all the latest conspiracy theories.
Not up to date.
I'm just going to say it at this point. Grace Blakeley is such a pathetic human being. She has no interest in hearing any other side of the story. All she cares about is cherry-picking her facts, cherry-picking her historical stories and saying, oh, look at all this. This is all related. We're actually under a feudal system, but I call it capitalism because I think it is. And when it comes to all counter-arguments, oh, it's just anti-Semites. Calling someone a globalist isn't an anti-Semitic remark. Calling someone a metropolitan elite isn't an anti-Semitic remark. If anything, it's a self-report, because it's you hearing that dog whistle that literally no one else can hear. Again, it's been said by many people, but leftists do just project. This is just projection. I can't really be bothered checking, but I would not be surprised. In fact, I would put money on Grace Blakeley being in favour of Palestine crushing Israel. Or, as you know, they put it nicely, a ceasefire that is unconditional, despite the fact that Hamas still hold Israeli hostages. But anyway, I'm not going to get into that mess, because I talk enough about that, because it's the number one issue in the UK for some reason.
I'm glad you mentioned the USSR, right? Because you would typically associate planned economies with those communist authoritarian states.
Yes, when people mention planned economies, people do tend to think about planned economies. I'm just going to love hearing the cope of how it wasn't real socialism and my democratic socialism is what I want, and I can just constantly invoke, yeah, but Lenin had one vote, lost it completely, and thought, okay, I'm just going to take over the parliament then.
But you argue in the book, right, that actually capitalist economies are quite closely resemble, right, a planned economy. So,
oh my God, how in God's name does she even get close to trying to say that? The most planned Britain ever got was during World War II, when we had rationing. And obviously we had a total war economy because Nazi Germany had a total war economy, and we obviously had to outcompete them on that front. And then obviously it took a few decades to actually get off rationing, but the point being is that how the hell has she managed to try and say that capitalist economies, even modern ones that I don't like, in any way resemble the planned economy you see in the USSR? What a ridiculous woman.
Who's doing the planning? How does it work? Talk us through it.
That is great. That was nearly an exact quote from my book when I say something like, what's important isn't the presence or absence of planning, it's who's doing the planning, how is it being undertaken, and in whose interests.
What a moronic thing to say. It doesn't matter whether there is planning or not, what matters who is doing the planning. So it does matter if there's planning or not, because you are saying there is planning. You absolute buffoon. And who's doing the planning? My God, just because corporations have a business structure and put resources towards products doesn't mean it is a planned economy. That is not what that means, you idiot.
Just for clarity, I'm not saying that there's no difference between a state socialist and a capitalist economy. Obviously, there is.
I get the feeling that she's about to say but.
Yeah.
But
it's just too easy.
I suppose what I'm arguing is that there is this scale along which you can chart most modern economies. You can place most modern economies on this scale between kind of pure anarchy and pure centralised control.
Does Grace Blakeley really think that she has just worked out the economic political spectrum? You know, when you look at the political compass test, you know when it's left and right? That is the economic scale, yes. Left is complete planned economy, right is complete free market economy. This is an idea that has been floated around for literally centuries, and for some reason Grace Blakeley thinks that she has found some specific ancient wisdom. No, it's the most basic thing on the political compass test. It is so basic in people's minds that it is literally one of the two main axes that people care about when it comes to politics. You total muffin.
But actually, the important thing to note as well is that that scale has maybe at least two axes, right? One of them concerns state planning and centralised control, and the other one concerns corporate planning and centralised control.
Oh my God, she doesn't know. She doesn't know that actually, depending how authoritarian or libertarian you are, but when you actually go to the middle of the left-right spectrum that we're talking about here, that's where you get corporatism. You know, the authoritarian side of that is obviously the Nazi parties and the Nazis' vampire economy, where all these corporations were owned by members of the Nazi party, and so effectively, instead of directly socialising it by having it under state control, they effectively have it under party control, with arms of the Nazi party being in the corporate world, being in the states, being in, you know, all sections of life. And the reason it's in the middle is because these corporations are still, to some degree, under market forces. The whole idea of the Soviet Union is that they didn't even believe in market forces and thought the idea of market should be abolished. Well, they thought that, and then they ended up with a load of black markets anyway, so, you know, take that as you will. But yes, there is a spectrum, and for some reason you think that despite there being a spectrum, you still think you need to add another axis to this. I mean, this is your brain on PPE.
So like the USSR, obviously there was like an immense amount of centralised control by the state over the economy. Bear in mind that centralized planning was never total, and it never can be. You never have a purely planned economy. You never have a purely anarchic economy.
I love how much she feels like she needs to simplify what she's saying. Typically, I found that after years of doing this, people tend to repeat points they've already made when they're not quite sure what they're talking about. I mean this. Go read any leftist book. They will make the same point over and over again, with examples obviously changing, but they'll manage to effectively make one point in a 200-page book. Whereas if you read something about like Basic Economics by Sowell, he'll have one chapter dedicated to a completely different concept and put all the examples he feels he needs to within that section. And over 200 pages, he'll have made about 20 different points. But saying that there's never a purely, state-controlled system, a purely anarchic system, yes, that was already covered when you brought up the spectrum.
Economies are always these kind of complex systems. They never, and this is kind of, again, an insight from systems theory, which Hayek, the famous neoliberal economist, really liked. It's the reason that he said that centralized planning would always kind of create all these unintended consequences, because you can't ever completely control a system as complex as an economy, as complex as a society.
Correct, yet you still want to do it. Like, you understand his argument. You seem to be rejecting it, though.
At the same time, those systems never collapse into complete anarchy. There's always some order, there's always some stability that emerges within those systems.
Yep, correct. I don't have anything to disagree with here. That's all just true. You can never have purely one or the other, because inevitably, like yin and yang, there needs to be some balance there. Some would say perfectly balanced, as all things should be.
So economies operate on this spectrum between anarchy and centralized coordination and control.
Sure, but you still seem to be on the side of, I really, really want complete control on this because I don't want people being richer than me. I mean, at the end of the day, that's all socialists really care about. Yet at the same time, you acknowledge there has to be some anarchy. Well, if you acknowledge there has to be anarchy in there, you're never going to get equality then. So why are you so insistent on having a system that produces equality?
And you see this today if you look at, for example, like Chinese state capitalism. Like, the Chinese economy is a capitalist economy. It's oriented around like the production of commodities for sale.
Another win for the anti-socialist side, by the way. I think it's silly to say that the economy is a capitalist economy. I mean, when people say state capitalist, they mean fascist, because that's what fascism was supposed to be, and well, still is. But they still have huge areas where they are still trying to plan the economy quite broadly. And then you have special economic areas where they had to liberalise the economies because, well, they needed to make money and people were dying. But they still take your stairs out your apartment if someone in that apartment complex has the coof. So, they got that going for them.
That is an incredibly centralised economy where you have both the state and extremely powerful corporations that have an immense amount of control over people's daily lives.
Yeah, and I find it amazing that you're trying to compare that to, corporations in the West. Like, yeah, they're not great, and I would rather that they didn't have the power that they do as well. But my God, you try and compare it to China. We're doing far better. I mean, most of China's economy is just building complexes out of porcelain and then demolishing them, because that's the way you make GDP.
At the same time, the state in the US is also, in some ways, fairly similar.
Again, I'll agree there's similarities, but they're more different than they're the same. There's a reason that we still outsource a lot of labour to China. It's because it's much cheaper, and it's much cheaper because they still haven't managed to develop the economy in such a way to increase the price of labour. They haven't really grown the economy properly. It's all just smoke and mirrors. It's a paper tiger, as they say. Because
you have an immense amount of corporate control over people's daily lives. You have some of the largest and most powerful corporations on the planet that are centered in the US. They have, a lot of them have kind of monopolistic control over their markets.
I mean, how is this controlling people's lives? I mean, everyone goes on about the illusion of choice, or you buy a Mars bar or a Snickers, they end up going to the same corporation, but that's not really controlling people's lives. They still have a choice just because it ends up going to the same corporation. I don't really have a problem with that. I'm fine with corporations diversifying, but it's not like in China where you won't be able to buy a Snickers bar if you didn't smile at a CCTV camera. As I say, they are more different than they are the same, but obviously there are similarities.
They have what's called kind of monopsony power in the labour market, which means that they're able to kind of control the market for labour.
Yeah, and, what's the reason we still have open borders all over the place? What's the reason, say, the UK has 700,000 net migrants a year, nearly 1 million gross? It's to keep labour cheap and corporations happy. Yeah, I get it. It's a completely different way to control the state than China is. In China, the state is at the very, very tippy top. In Britain and the US, there's actually a bit of a battle between corporations and the British state, or the American state, and they end up coming to compromises rather than in China, where it's just what the party says goes. You know, a bit like what happened in Nazi Germany.
They have immense lobbying power. They kind of shape what happens within the state at both the kind of federal level and a more local level.
Yeah, but again, I'm going to use the housing market as my example here. It's a lot different to China. As I say, they just make their houses out of really poorly made concrete and porcelain, then they just demolish it 5 years later because no one's living in them. What happened in the UK, well, the Town and Country Planning Act and other building regulations meant that it was actually quite difficult for anyone to build a house unless you properly followed those regulations, and basically the only company that can do that now is Barratt Homes. So they're making huge amounts of new build estates that don't look very good. Most of them you have to do a shared ownership type thing with the company, which actually is probably the most expensive way to buy a house, by the way, because you're paying off a mortgage and at the same time paying rent and at the same time having to pay the ground fee for owning a home on land you don't technically own. But then at the same time, when Barratt comes to actually building new builds, you get an awful lot of pushback from local councils. So as I say, there's a constant battle between corporations and the state in Britain and the US, and I'd say that's a hell of a lot better in an awful lot of ways than over in China. Obviously, there are some advantages to just having one of those entities in complete control, but on balance, from everything I can tell, I'd rather live in Britain than live in China.
They have kind of this immense ecological power to shape the future of, our relationship with the climate.
Oh god, another terrible example. China is building the equivalent of about 3 power plants a month or something like that, coal power plants a month. The UK has managed to get to half of its CO2 emissions from its peak in the Industrial Revolution. Again, even from your perspective of being a bit on the green side of things, Britain is a hell of a lot better than China.
And they have the power to kind of avoid and evade tax, to promulgate laws, to break the law with impunity.
Well, an awful lot of the time they break the law and end up getting fined, but the money they saved from breaking the law actually means that they probably saved money by just paying the fine. So it's not with impunity, it's just that the law isn't punishing them enough to make it not worth it.
There's this massive issue of kind of corporate impunity where you have basically corporations allowed to break the law without any sanction whatsoever.
I mean, to be fair, it does happen, and I agree that shouldn't be happening. There we go, end of discussion.
And all of this power is exercised, as I said, with very little accountability because these institutions have so much power within the state.
Well, I'm not being funny. If we had decent alternative parties, you'd probably see them actually get punished for once. But nobody wanted Corbyn because he was a lunatic. I mean, I say nobody. Actually, an awful lot of Zoomers and millennials wanted him. And nobody finds Richard Tice particularly captivating. They just need someone with charisma in reform, and they will actually probably go against an awful lot of what corporations want. And they probably will actually fight the civil service to get an awful lot of these things through. But every political party just appears to be a failure, and now we're getting Labour in, well, they're just going to increase the power of the state and probably get closer to China, as in China's way of running things. So things are only going to get worse. Grace Blakeley is pretty much going to get what she wants and then complain that the outcome wasn't what she wanted, so it wasn't real socialism. That is going to happen at some point. And that would definitely have happened under Corbyn.
So, we like to think of the divide, as I've said, within our politics as one between kind of, centrally planned socialist economies on the one hand, like we had in the USSR, and then these lovely free market, democratic, capitalist economies on the other hand.
And instead, no, and I'm sure she'll say this, we get, well, apart from when Corbyn was in, which was definitely state socialism, but yes, we just get slightly different flavours of state capitalism, if you want to call it that, corporatism, I don't really care. But from people whose incentives are effectively, yes, to serve global corporations. Hence, nothing ever seems to get done about illegal migrants coming over, nothing seems to get done about legal migrants coming over, nothing realistically seems to get done about the cost of living crisis, if, not that I buy that as an actual thing that's happening, it's more people are needing to save a bit more because, well, again, over COVID, corporations were served by allowing Amazon and all that to keep running as a business, while the corner shops weren't allowed to open and sell their newspapers.
But actually, if you take the kind of big superpowers that we've seen in the world economy over the last kind of 100 years, the USSR, the US and China, all of them share in common this immense centralization of power at the center among this core of state apparatchiks, heads of major companies, heads of major financial institutions.
And you think all that's capitalism? You think China runs on a capitalist market? Well, as I say, yes, there is some similarities here, but no. America and the UK are not China. It is a completely different kettle of fish over there, and once again, it is a socialist saying, oh, China wasn't real socialism. And they don't seem to learn the fact that if you actually do get real socialism, it pretty quickly turns into a bit of a dystopia. Despite people saying Shanghai's great. Well, why is Shanghai great? Oh, it's in a special economic zone where they're actually allowed to have markets to some degree.
And all of them share this problem. Or, if you're an elite, this positive element, which is that the vast majority of people have no real control over what happens in their daily lives. They feel as though they have no power.
I have literally no idea what she means by that. What power am I supposed to have, over the state? I don't really understand. I've had the ability to buy a house. I've had the ability to buy my computer, get my job, drive around Wales at 20 miles an hour. Okay, I guess I feel powerless there. I feel powerless in stopping the 20 mile per hour madness. But actually then, when it comes to the next Welsh elections, I will have some power there. So I don't know what she means by any of that. I guess if she started saying, oh, people don't feel like they can open a business because it will fail straight away, I'd be like, yeah, I'm with you on that. When it comes to the rest of life, though, I don't know what she means.
Now, of course, what I argue in the book is that we do have power if we are able to organise and resist the power that is exerted upon society by these institutions.
God, that is so cringe. When socialists say we need to organise, it's a meaningless jargon word. It doesn't mean anything. What are you going to do? Get together in a town hall? Right, then what? Oh, we're going to organise. What does that even mean? Because there is no way you are organising to pick up rifles and put up arms in Parliament. You are not doing that. So great, what are we going to do? Make voting blocks. Oh, you already do that because you're all vote Labour anyway. Good job.
Then we can begin to change things.
How? This is exactly like the underpant gnomes from South Park. Step 1, organise. Step 2, question mark. Step 3, resist. You're missing the actual mechanism here. What are the details of organising? Because it's never explained. And then the best case scenario you have for it is something like Antifa in Portland. What happened over there? Oh, they all went to Seattle and took over, 2 square miles of the city, and that lasted about 2 weeks because too many women got raped. Great. Your idea of organising is just having an awful anarchic society where people can't even grow tomatoes. Unbelievable.
But the world in which we live is one in which we're told you as an isolated individual have no power up against this system that is basically kind of all-encompassing.
Yes, you have I suppose you can call it a window of your life where you do have control. You can certainly get to the very top of that, and then even when you get to the top of that, material conditions can change. You get exponentially more successful, that window goes up and up and up. That can easily happen. The idea that you have freedom in your life isn't the freedom to do anything, and this is what a lot of Marxists don't seem to understand about, the type of perspectives that someone like me has or capitalists have. The idea is that to be someone like Jeff Bezos or someone like Elon Musk, you have to be very, very lucky. And it's not just being very, very lucky, it's also being very, very studious, very, very conscientious, and very, very hard-working, along with making good decisions. Not everyone is going to be an Elon Musk. Not everyone is going to have that freedom, and that's never been the point. But what you can do is appreciate the cards you have been dealt and do with them the best you can. That is what the freedom is. It's put best in Starship Troopers.
Figuring things out for yourself is the only freedom anyone really has.
And yeah, that's the point. The point isn't to have everyone have the same opportunity, everyone to have the same material conditions. The point is that you're born into this world, you don't know where the hell you're going to be, but you figure things out for yourselves, you do what's best for you, and, a lot of the time you'll find yourselves on the upper ends of that window in life that you have. And obviously sometimes the worst type of luck can happen to you and you can find yourself, out on the streets. And you know what? Fine. There's got to be some order in life. I don't want to see homeless people on the street. Fine, give them a shelter, give them somewhere to work, make it easier for them, and give them the opportunity to at least figure something better out for themselves. That is absolutely fine. Giving everyone a free infinity pool or whatever it was that Aaron Bastani said, absolutely clown world take that, and I wouldn't be surprised if Grace Blakeley agrees with it.
Even as you're told, oh, you do have the power to kind of decide what you want to consume and decide who you want to vote for, and you're in this like free market system where you're completely free to make those micro decisions on a daily basis.
Again, it's all these really surface level things. You actually do have the ability to go live in the woods, if that's what you really want. But no one does it, because no one really wants to live in the woods. Forget all those return to monkey type people. They're not serious people. If they were serious, they'd be living off the grid, living like Liver King in the middle of some dense forest in Scotland or Canada or the US. It's just much easier for everyone to live in civilization, and they clearly agree with that. But if you went a bit deeper and say, oh, I want to make my own local institution, I want to make my own business, that's actually a hell of a lot harder. I know, because I know business owners. The best way typically to do it is to get in the tech sector. But obviously not everyone can do that. But, there's a load of car dealerships, there's a load of, mechanics. Hell, at my mum and dad's local area, a new restaurant opens every year in the same area, in the same unit, because it's basically just impossible to make it work there because the rents are so high. And on top of that, you have a ludicrous amount of taxes you need to pay if you run a business. I am all for making all that easier and expanding people's freedom to make business, because that's what makes the economy grow. But Grace Blakeley isn't about that. No, Grace Blakeley is just like, oh, I want people to have infinite pools and all the housing they want, without any real thought behind how do we actually get people to do that. I mean, at least the Bolsheviks were open about you've got to work as well as earn your, well, not particularly earn, but get your keep. And then, well, getting your keep meant standing in line for hours for a slice of bread. But this is the thing. All these Marxists and modern-day Marxists want is to have to do nothing but talk nonsense on the internet and have absolutely everything they want from life for free. Like, they want to be useless people, effectively. And guess what? No system in the world is going to grant you that, even in the far stretch to the future.
And yet the whole structure of the society in which you live has already been decided by someone else. And as a voter, as a consumer, you have very little influence over how those decisions are made.
Yep, sure, this is why I'm all for completely cutting down the size of the state and having them completely almost uninvolved in my life. Do you keep the streets safe, do you jail criminals, and do you protect the borders? Those are the three things that I want the government to do. And they're not even doing most of that well.
I really want to drill into that feeling of powerlessness.
Yeah.
I think it's so relevant. Our inability to imagine an alternative, even though, as you write and as others have written as well, there are alternatives.
Yeah, capitalist realism, I've read snippets of it. Mark Fisher, again, like Grace Blakeley, doesn't particularly understand the world we live in. And, a big reason people can't think of an alternative to capitalism is because, again, as Grace Blakeley herself said, obviously there always needs to be a balance. There always needs to be some anarchy. And what happens in anarchy? Well, you go back to caveman times, where you didn't really have large-scale social systems. What were they doing? Oh, they were trading under a capitalist system. Oh, they must have been oppressed. Total clowns. You can go as far in the future as you want. Capitalism will always reign supreme, because at the end of the day, people understand that if you trade, both parties are getting a better deal out of it, because what they are giving away, whether it be money or in a bartering system, that is worth less than what they are receiving. Again, apart from the odd fraudulent case, which again, I'm fine with having laws against.
There are, at risk of sounding like slightly sincere and earnest, like joyful alternatives, right, where people can find self-expression, self-realization, self-actualization. But it's almost one of the defining characteristics of the system, right, is its ability to drum out, reduce, minimalize any idea or possibility of conceiving of something alternative.
Dude, don't give me this nonsense. People from Novara Media, people from all sorts of left-wing media outlets and think tanks are constantly on the television, on interviews like this, and on panel shows, constantly putting out that, oh, isn't it terrible what we're in, here's an alternative. No, don't give me that nonsense. People are constantly thinking up of alternatives. They all just suck. And when an actual alternative that goes in the opposite direction of the left comes out, i.e. someone like Liz Truss, she's not allowed to stay in power, while we all the time swim slowly leftward. Constantly. Gay marriage came in under a Tory government, for God's sake. There's no right-wing alternative here that's allowed to be successful until it takes an absolutely stonking majority in Parliament. We thought that's what was going to happen under Boris Johnson, and it turned out even he's completely left-wing. And they have to get him out under completely equally ludicrous circumstances like Liz Truss.
Yeah, and I think this problem actually comes down to something that's shifted with the transition towards neoliberalism.
You think this happened back in the 80s?
So what I argue in the book, right, the neoliberals, the shift that we had in the 1980s with Thatcher, with Reagan, this idea that we needed kind of privatization, free markets, a shrinking of the state.
Oh, right, cool. She's actually talking about proper neoliberalism. That's interesting.
None of those, like the shrinking of the state didn't actually happen. Those were all kind of ideological justifications for what was actually just a massive reassertion of the power of big business, of finance, etc.
That wasn't actually a shrinking of the state. It was just the state shrinking so that power ended up going into finance and other sectors that aren't in the public realm. I mean, all I have to cite is right to buy. It was literally the biggest transfer of wealth from the state to individuals and families probably ever in the UK. You can buy a council house at a discounted price. It massively increased home ownership, and it was so good, even people that pretend to hate it like Angela Rayner partook in it. It's just ridiculous to say that it didn't shrink the size of the state. Of course it did. It completely shrank its economic power. It was only under Tony Blair that it started to rise again.
And a crushing of the power of working people, particularly the labour movement.
Oh, the labour movement is not representative of working people, and I'm fed up of hearing that. A lot of working people did not like unions. In fact, they would have been on the scab side of things if they weren't forced to join unions and weren't allowed to vote secretly in their votes. In fact, it was Labour unions and Labour itself that closed more coal mines than Maggie Thatcher. It was Labour that took more milk away from children than Thatcher did. Thatcher just did it for primary school. Labour took it away from everyone in secondary school. Because, again, economic reality. You can't just keep giving people free stuff. And then she tried to equalise the tax system. I mean, it's just ridiculous to try and claim that actually under neoliberalism and Margaret Thatcher, the state didn't shrink. Of course it did.
But you had these narratives that were like, we need privatization, we need deregulation, and that's going to deliver free markets and promote personal freedom and autonomy, basically.
Yes, that was indeed the idea, and Margaret Thatcher did a decent job of implementing an awful lot of it.
In fact, what we've seen is, in many ways, a kind of expansion of the power of the state and an expansion of corporate power alongside that. Often we see kind of state power wielded through the private sector as well. I use some examples in the book like, G4S, McKinsey, these kind of like quasi public institutions that are often charged with just astonishing corruption or mismanagement or fraud or whatever.
The state uses private contracts for a lot of things, therefore that is the expansion of the state. No, it's backwards logic. The most charitable I will be with this position is that yes, when they do give out private contracts to security firms like G4S, they do let them get away with an awful lot more because when they know that they're probably going to have to jack their prices up if they're having to start to pay out for all these lawyers and court cases. But my God, you're making it out like G4S is owned by someone in the Tory party. I mean, we don't know that. In fact, the CEO is a South African, so I actually do highly doubt that. But yes, there probably is an awful lot of corruption, and yes, the state probably is overreaching with its power, but your answer is then to give the state more power. I know you say, oh, actually, it'll be to the people because of democracy, but that democracy is obviously going to go in a different way to what you expect because that keeps happening to you, and you'll want to take over anyway. It's a moot argument you are making, I'm afraid.
So, that the neoliberal shift wasn't actually about shrinking the state. What it was about crushing collective power.
It was actually about refuting Keynesianism. The idea that, effectively, yes, the state can continually print money, and it won't matter as long as it keeps putting its investments in the right sectors that will grow and grow and grow, and that will therefore outweigh inflation since the amount of useful products being made will keep inflation under control. However, when you keep investing in things like coal, which is losing money, then you are naturally not going to see the growth and therefore you'll get inflation and then you'll end up with a load of strikes since these workers aren't getting paid what they need to get paid, and then you end up with the winter of discontent where bodies pile up in the streets and rubbish isn't collected, and the whole of Britain's just a depressing time over Christmas. And then you vote Margaret Thatcher in and she fixes the whole thing and privatises, gets inflation under control and does everything she needs to. Complete refutation of Keynesianism. And part of that is crushing collective power because those investments go to these either public or, sometimes private corporations, but a lot of them were public. And they just kept funding the trade union, which was just an arm of the Labour Party, which had, their own massive problems with corruption as well. Arthur Scargill is a millionaire for a reason. So again, this is just Grace Blakeley cherry-picking facts yet again.
And you see this with like the first moves that politicians like Thatcher and Reagan undertake when they come into power. It was crush the labour movement.
Yeah, because unions were absolutely ridiculous. My parents and even my girlfriend's parents talk about the ridiculousness that the power that unions had, which was, as I said before, you had to join a union if you got a job in these sectors, say coal mining. You had to be part of the union there. You didn't get a choice. And then when you were in there, you couldn't vote secretly. So everyone knew if you voted against, say, striking. And guess what? You got beat up for going against what the unions wanted. So of course Margaret Thatcher comes in, and of course it's actually massively popular that the unions got destroyed. And then it's people who retired at 30 and have been getting a state pension literally since they were 30, saying, oh, Margaret Thatcher ruined my life. No, she bribed you to shut up, and you can't even have the decency to realise you probably had it best out of everyone in the coal mining industry.
And there was a discourse that surrounded this as well. So there was the physical assertion of the power of the state. There was the literal beating up of miners, the use of the police to put them in their place.
Yeah, and an awful lot of the time that's because they were rioting.
But there was this ideological shift as well, which was you are not a worker, you are not a citizen, you are a consumer, you are, an entrepreneur of the self, right?
I mean, an entrepreneur and a consumer are completely different things. If you're an entrepreneur, yeah, you are actually an individual who is, at the very least, attempting some sort of creativity to either market something that exists in a new way that makes it actually valuable to other people. A good example is Guinness making an advert saying, good things come to those who wait, and then people started buying Guinnesses because they realised, oh, I do actually quite like this drink and I will wait for the 10 minutes for it to be poured. Or you make something completely new, not necessarily completely new, or innovate on a product that already exists, or innovate, well, I suppose in some ways a brand new product, and have that be absolutely valuable to an awful lot of people. Great example of that, the iPhone. It was a BlackBerry, but a hell of a lot better, touch screen, plus it's got YouTube on it, can connect to the internet, effectively works as a mini computer in your hand with a decent screen. And yeah, that's quite a bit different to being a consumer. I mean, I really do hate this idea of consumer capitalism is bad when everyone seems to absolutely love partaking in it, despite it being uncool. I'm pretty sure they're both wearing designer shoes, by the way.
And a lot of neoliberal policies were designed to push this. It was like, we will allow you to buy your own house. We will privatise your pension.
Oh my goodness, the horror.
You will be able to take out loads of debt.
Well, as long as you can pay it back, generally that was the rule. Yes, the issue came about in 2008 because they were allowing too many people that couldn't pay the debt to have the debt.
Your life will become this balance sheet of assets and liabilities, and it's up to you to manage that.
Yeah, that sounds great. Why would I want anyone else to have that power over what I own? Like, what a ridiculous thing to say. As soon as I say pay off my phone, that's no one else's, that's mine. I'm really happy with that fact. I don't want anyone else touching my pension. How is that unreasonable? I don't want anyone else having their say-so over what I can do in my house and on my land. How is that not reasonable?
If you manage it well, you will do well and you will succeed. If you manage it badly, you will fail, and that will be entirely your own fault.
Largely, yes it is, and I'm fed up of having to go on TikTok and explain this to people. People who get themselves in debt typically have done it over their own volition. They get too harked up about, oh, I want to have higher status, how do I get higher status? Well, owning the latest shoes tends to be a good way to do it. I'll go in debt for it. Oh, I'll have a nicer car and I'll go in debt for it. Can I afford all this debt? No. Whose fault is that? Yes, it is theirs. If they can't manage it, it is their own fault, and it is mostly up to them to get themselves out of it, or have the support network around them to help. For God's sake, people are not children.
Even things like the privatisation of education, right? Education becomes an investment in your human capital.
Yes, that's the idea, and I swear to God, if she's about to start going on about student loans, I'm just going to lose it. I'm nearly losing it at this point.
And it's up to you to undertake that investment and to make the best of it.
What's wrong with any of this? What's wrong with any of what you've just said?
So you see this ideological decimation of the collective consciousness that was really the foundation of the post-war consensus.
Yes, it stunk. It sucked. It led to people literally not being able to create toilets because the union said you'd be taking someone else's job if you applied the handle to it. Therefore you can't do it and you need to wait till he's back off sick leave. And you dare start making more toilets, well, we're going to go on strike. The country came to a standstill. What do you think the 3-day week was? My parents still talk about how they played Monopoly by candlelight 4 days a week because they just didn't have electricity for 4 days. The experiment failed. It sucked. You get Margaret Thatcher in, basically everything gets better. It got so good that the Labour Party had to decimate their Keynesianism and get Tony Blair in as a facade of this new neoliberal order. What happens when he gets in? Oh no, he puts in an awful lot of neo-Keynesianism. What happens after 2008? You get blatant neo-Keynesianism with quantitative easing. MMT seems to now be the prevailing economic theory. You actually have people unironically saying that all tax money is actually for is to keep inflation down rather than to actually fund the government because they can just print money. Like, we knew that didn't work thanks to the Weimar Republic.
And its replacement with this rampant, toxic individualism. And I actually think that a lot of the problems that we have in our society today, whether it's like, you know, the crazy stuff that you see on social media, whether it's this sense of powerlessness, whether it's even like, you know, low pay as a result of people not being able to organize, they all come back to this question of individualism.
19th century Britain was the most individualistic society we've ever had. We had a monarchy, effectively. An awful lot of the way Britain was run was entirely through private companies, private businesses. You had plenty of independent corner shops. And as I say, name a single monopoly from that time. The most you could probably come up with was certain train tycoons, but even then you had multiple different train companies building lines. And a problem at that time wasn't the type of problems we are seeing today. It wasn't the rampant individualism, as you call it, that we see today. I think a main issue with that is genuinely through education and through this weirdly, and it's coming from people like Grace Blakeley, this weird obsession with everyone having maximal freedom. Like, she wants maximum individual freedom. I don't even think that's reasonable. It's a complete breakdown of the societal consensus and societal rules that we had. Oh, you know, back in the day, in the 1800s, you had to get married effectively. You know, if you had a child out of wedlock, boom, you get married straight away. You'd have that institution going strong. You'd have religious institutions bringing people together, and then outside of the church services, you'd have massive, and I mean massive amounts of charity work going on. What happened during the Irish famine? You had loads of donations going over there, brought about collectively and also by individuals. Queen Victoria sent £2,000 over, which was the single biggest donation and worth something like $500,000 today. But we don't do that because we outsourced all of that collective work, if you want to call it that, outsourced it all to the state in World War II and in the post-war consensus. They were like, oh, we came together as a country to beat this existential threat, let's continue that. The only reason that worked is because you had the existential threat. When you don't have that anymore, you need to go back to your friendly societies. You need to go back to your local collective work. And that's just been decimated. No one goes to church anymore. No one really does voluntary work all that much anymore. And if they do, it's through ridiculous charities like we went through last time with Shelter. Oh, sorry, that was in a different video, still with Politics Joe. But, you know, when I was giving to Shelter, I thought that was my charity work done. But no, people actually need to look into this sort of thing. All they really do is run a glorified helpline and push legislation through Parliament. That is all they do. They are a glorified think tank. And I'm not giving my money to that. And you're not seeing that much charity work being done in the private sector anymore. In fact, most of it seems to go abroad. Because charity in the UK means push the government to do more. That's all charity in the UK does now. Whereas back in the 19th century, charities would say to the government, hey, we're okay to do good work over in Ireland, right? And the government would say, yeah, of course, we don't care. Whereas now it's, you can't do anything without our say-so, and we won't even give you permission when you ask for it. It's just ridiculous.
And you hear this, particularly among young people, there's a sense that when things go wrong, it's your own fault. You have no one to blame but yourself.
Yes, an awful lot of the time that is actually true, and I'm fed up of saying it. I constantly have to tell people the things I went through to buy a house. An awful lot of sacrifice. And these people keep saying, well, why shouldn't I be allowed to take away a week? As if that's what they're actually doing. I know people that say that. They get like 4 a week. It's absolutely ridiculous when they say that.
And I think this is really like damaging people's mental health. There's this sense of like deep and profound shame at not being able to compete in the same way as maybe those around you.
No, the studies have been done on this. It's the coddling that an awful lot of millennials and Zoomers have had growing up, where actually your feelings come first. How do you feel? You know, if you ask kids simply, what are you going to do about the situation you're in? It increases their confidence. It's better for their mental health. But since it's oh, how do you feel? And it's like, oh, you know, I feel sad that this happened. And then it runs straight to, oh, well, we'll tell the head teacher or something about what happened. And, you know, we'll get them punished because that's what you want. When in reality, you know, I was bullied at school and I didn't really want anything to be done about it. I think at the time it was more of a, I don't want to bother other people about this because I know it's a me thing, and I know this person's nasty, and really I just need to sack up and tell him that I don't like him and avoid him, which I did actually end up doing with some of my bullies. And the only time I ever went into a teacher's room about it was when one of my friends decided, you know what, I will tell the teacher about it. And I just felt really uncomfortable telling them about it because I didn't feel like it was their problem. And this kid that did it, well, you know, every time something bad happened at school, I mean, one time, I can't remember what the head teacher said, but the head teacher said something completely reasonable that he just took badly. The next day, the parents were in school demanding to see the head teacher. Like, that is the sort of thing that's going to give your kid mental health problems because they think all their problems are going to be solved. Whereas in reality, I think the most stable people on the planet at the moment, and especially in the West, are, frankly, I just think they're people that go to church. And if not that, it is certainly people who deal with their own problems. I mean, I think it's absolutely ridiculous that you need to outsource your problems to other people and expect them to actually solve them 100% for you. That's the issue. I mean, obviously sometimes you will need outsourced help. That's obviously a reasonable thing to have. But when I've had things like that, I've obviously returned the favour. Grace Blakeley is the type of person that thinks you don't need to return the favour, though.
I think this feeds the rise of the far right.
Oh, for goodness sake.
I think young men who feel that they are unable to kind of portray the kind of alpha characteristics that are associated with like elite men get this sense of like resentment and anger that they then kind of take out on the system as a whole.
Yeah, and your solution to that is to treat them like women. Good job. Literally, I do mean this. The solution to the far right problem is just to encourage these men to go into manual labour work. But you can't do that because it doesn't pay enough, because all of these jobs keep being outsourced to the millions of immigrants that are coming in. An awful lot of men actually do realise this, and that's why they seem to be against immigration to the extent that they are, but you're never going to accept that. It's actually amazing. I keep thinking about this, but left-wingers actually want every single policy that actually leads to state capitalism just increasing in power, leads to corporations keeping their stranglehold on everyone. And honestly, as long as they have a union where they feel the union is actually doing something, they'd all probably be happy. Whereas I'd absolutely hate it. This is why I've joined a small company, because I know that my work is impacting the company in a large way. I can directly see that, and I can literally see the company grow before my eyes, and I love that. And I think an awful lot of men want to see that too, with their own personal growth and with whatever project they are working on. But they don't particularly have the chance to do that because we feminised everything and made it practically impossible for them to actually make their own business successful. Not practically, it's obviously possible, but it's a hell of a lot more difficult than it was 20 years ago.
And this again comes down to this idea of like competitive individualism. It is up to you to compete and do well, and if you can't do that, then you're a loser and a failure.
Oh, that's a meme from the left wing. Absolutely everyone successful knows that you will fail hundreds of times before you get to the success. People only really say that they're losers if they start failing and then give up. That's the only time people really call other people losers under the system. And then obviously there are times where things outside of the person's control happen to them, and then yeah, people don't really call those people losers. But there are so many social programs today. I don't understand how you could be in dire straits unless you did something stupid like buy a car you couldn't afford. That's when you're called a loser, when you make stupid decisions.
And all of this comes back to this shift that was at the heart of neoliberalism, which is that there's no such thing as society, which is what Thatcher said. It's all just a collection of isolated individuals competing against each other.
They always leave out the cooperation part as well. An awful lot of it is individuals cooperating. And they're leaving out the context of why Margaret Thatcher said there is no such thing as society, because she's effectively saying that there are far too many people who run into a problem and want to outsource the problem, as I've been saying. Oh, it's the government's job to deal with my problem. I have a problem and I want a grant. I am homeless and I want a home. And what she means by there is no society is that there is no such thing as this mythological societal blob that is going to deal with all your problems. It's actually other people like you that have to deal with your problem. That is what she means by there's no society. She means that you are society, and therefore your problems must be dealt with by yourself. And you should be grateful, in fact, if you can get help. That was a point. You need to be grateful that other people exist to help you. And actually, we're going to reduce the amount of help you get because it's just ridiculous at the moment.
Think about like 50, 60 years ago, if you as a worker were dissatisfied with your pay, or you went home and you couldn't put food on the table, you would have gone into your workplace, chatted with your co-workers, chatted with your union rep and said, look, like, are you in the same position as me? Because I can't afford to feed my kids. And they would have been like, yeah, you're right. Okay, well, we need to do something about this. We need to go on strike and organise because our boss is exploiting us.
It's just a fairy tale. It's just a complete fairy tale. I'm not saying that there weren't workers who ran into trouble. I'm not saying that there were workers that felt they were paid less than they should be being paid. However, pretty much everything unions did, it was in favour of the union reps' incentives, which was basically, we're going to do anything really that makes us richer. Because they were Marxists, they believed in, frankly, nothing but materialism. So anything that improved their position on the axis of materialism was a thing that they should do. And as I say, this is why a lot of the old union reps, Arthur Scargill, turned into millionaires. That's why modern day union representatives like Mick Lynch have an awful lot of luxury goods that a lot of other people can't afford. He has his own house, and not just his own house that is worth millions. If you think trade unions were there to help out the workers, then you are mythologizing what was actually happening at the time. Margaret Thatcher was so popular because she destroyed the trade unions. As you say, one of the first things she did was neuter their power. She then got elected in 2 more times after that before the own Tory party had to kick her out.
Today, if you can't put food on the table, what do? You blame yourself. You maybe go out and get a personal loan at a very high interest rate. Some people become depressed because they're like, I can't afford to feed my family, I'm a loser. There's no sense of your, collective power, or indeed the way in which you are being exploited because of your position within the system.
There are millions of people using food banks. Don't give me this nonsense. As said before, barely anyone is suffering from malnutrition in the UK. What starvation means in the UK at this point is people may miss a meal once in a while, or they've had to be a bit careful with how they budget between their food and, say, their heating. Guess what? I've had to do that. I would not consider myself hungry. And then, as I say, millions of people use food banks all over the UK. If you can't afford to feed your family, you get referred to a food bank. Problem with that is that pretty much everyone has an anecdote of someone they know who goes to a food bank who also gets takeaway. If you can afford takeaway, you can afford about 5 meals. That's how expensive takeaway is these days.
It's my fault, right? Or sometimes it's their fault, right? It's scroungers or immigrants or whatever. It's like some problem over there.
I mean, reports just keep coming out recently that actually the levels of immigration we have are actually worsening the economy because so many of them are taking out more than they're putting in. So, yeah. But I do love how quickly she pivoted from, everyone feels it's their fault, to actually, no, they still externalise the problem. Like, look, on the societal level, yes, I think that I think it's like 4 million people at this point are on out-of-work benefits without the requirement to work. And then more 20 to 30-year-olds are out of work based on a disability than people over the age of 40. Like, no, actually, a lot of young people are externalising their own problems. Because an awful lot of those disabilities are mental health issues, which I think pretty much everyone can agree at this point are clearly overdiagnosed. And they're overdiagnosed because they give you advantages. If they didn't give you any advantages, most people wouldn't even bother seeing if they have them. And they certainly wouldn't try and just pay a private doctor to get the diagnosis from them, which they effectively pay for. And what happens if you're out of work based on these disabilities? You get free money. Most of those people can actually work. I have no doubt about that. But that doesn't mean that you yourself, with absolutely no problems with you, can't be successful. I was. You can do it too.
And that, I think, is really what is preventing us from being able to resist. Because if people did have this greater sense of like collective agency, then, we would have stronger unions. People would be organising in their workplaces to demand higher wages.
Every time. Do what I did. Get another job. I worked 60 hours a week at one point. I constantly go on about this. To learn how to code. And then I got a job in software. Pays a lot better than if I stayed in retail. You can do that too. Yeah, it sucks. Yeah, it's hard work, but this is the whole point. It's the whole marshmallow test. Do you have one marshmallow now, or do you wait 10 minutes so that you can have 2 marshmallows? It's just that, but scaled right up to the point where you could actually afford a house if you just work hard now. And trust me, when you're younger, that is when you're better able to do that. So you may as well use it.
We would have tenants unions, right? People wouldn't be so easy to exploit within the private rented sector.
Another terrible example. That private rented sector is so regulated that typically you get better outcomes than the public rented sector or social housing where there's a load of mould. And not only that, good tenants want good landlords. They typically self-organise into the good tenants get the good landlords and they're not the ones complaining. So there you go.
People would be pouring out onto the streets saying, you know, we cannot afford to heat our homes. This is a failure of our political class.
I do love how the whole situation here is Grace Blakeley effectively saying, oh, people are externalising the problems to things I don't like, immigrants and scroungers, whereas really they should be externalising the problems to people that I do want them to blame it on, the Tories. That's all it comes down to every time. It's just, I hate people doing better than me. Externalise the problem to them. That's all it comes down to. And don't get me wrong, Tories aren't great. I want them out too. But I want them out because they're stopping me and the business I work for, although that is also due to Labour in the Welsh government, from expanding properly to the fullest extent. We would have such a better time in the UK if we actually had a free market, honestly.
But instead, it's, I'm a failure, I have to use a food bank, right?
In a lot of ways, you probably are a failure, but, you know, you used the word loser before. They're two different concepts. A loser is someone who's a failure and doesn't try to improve their own position in life. They instead externalise the problem and want someone else to deal with it for them. You can be a failure and a winner, which is someone who has failed somewhere in their life and got to a good position from it. My brother's a good example. I'm sure I've mentioned it before. He got a 3rd in his degree and started having trouble to actually find a job. And then he ended up finding quite a few. And now he owns his own house, has a child, and like everyone, can't afford everything he wants. But my God, he is a success after having failed at some point in his life. Like, that's absolutely fine. It happens, Grace. No one thinks you're a loser because you failed. No one necessarily thinks you're a loser because you go to a food bank. But I will say the shaming going to a food bank is a good thing, because at least that shows that you want to get yourself out of that position. So that is a good thing to do.
This like toxic individualism that has become so pervasive within our society has allowed our political class to basically get away with murder.
Good Lord, don't get too hyperbolic.
Because instead of blaming them, we all blame ourselves or we blame each other.
No, my entire YouTube channel is pretty much blaming the government for an awful lot of things. However, with the hand that we have been dealt in this country, you can actually do quite a lot with it. In fact, one thing that I say to people that don't particularly care about the country in terms of its, you know, history or have the love for it that I do, I'll just say move to Australia. Like, you can do that. I know loads of people that have done that and they have much better lives. And realistically, I want to be in a position where they actually want to stay in this country because economically it makes sense, while at the same time being even harsher than the Aussies when it comes to immigration. Anyway, that will do for today's video. I'm trying to keep these from, you know, trying to keep these to an hour, but I need to finish off the sections when I start them, so there you go. We are just under halfway through the video at this point. I might try and make the next episode the last one I go through, because she at this point is just repeating an awful lot of her points, and, well, of course she is. She had one point to make: I don't like capitalism. And then apply it to places where they don't exist, or blame people taking responsibility for their own actions as toxic. So, yeah, there you go. That's all I had for you today. Regional Variations should be on tonight, and as mentioned, I'll be on Alfred the Invincible's channel on Sunday, so keep an eye out on my Twitter for that, link in the description. Anyway, as I say, that's everything I had for you today. So, once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.